So I wanted to talk to you about the difference between change management and change control. Because sometimes people use those words interchangeably or they even confuse them when in fact they are two distinct and completely different processes. There are a couple of overlaps, but it makes sense that you understand, especially if you're going into an interview or you're going into a role where they talk about this. It makes sense that you understand what the difference is. So let me start with change management. So change management is more like a systemized method of embedding change into an organization. So process. It's around thinking about how we bring people along on a journey where we have transformation or transition. It could be that we were, if I were to break it down even further, let's say we were all using Android phones in our organization and suddenly we decided that we now want to start using iPhones. So there's a process where we need to carry people along on that transition from Android phones to iPhones. So there's a whole science around change management, usually focusing on things like communication, training, to be able to deal with people's, attitude to change. And in many cases, try to reduce resistance to change. So that's really about the science of change management. And it's an entire science. There's a lot of principles and processes underlying that are part of that change management process. Okay, all that thoughts. Then let's talk about change control. So in project management, we talk about the project management triangle. So we talk about time, cost, quality. Some people call it time, cost, scope. But in very simple terms, when we're doing a project, we kind of have an idea that this is going to take 6 months. We're building a bungalow. It's a 3-bedroom bungalow. It's going to take us 6 months. It's going to cost us £1 million. So that's what we're trying to do. Now, somewhere along the line, customer comes along and says, I don't want to do a bungalow anymore that's 3-bedroom, and I want it to be a skyscraper, 20-story building. Okay? So change control is the process by which we, first of all, understand the change that the client or whoever it is trying to introduce, and we look to assess the change. That when we say assess, we're trying to understand, okay, if we're going to do this, what's the impact? I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail and see whether we can do the change in a controlled manner. So this is all about taking in change into a project in a controlled manner. So breaking that down, if you have that situation whereby you were building a bungalow and the person comes along and says, I want a 20-story building or a 60-story building, whatever it was, the whole concept of change and control is, okay, we hear your request for change, but the whole concept is there's a whole process for ensuring that, can we even do this thing you're asking us to do? So we'll assess it. We will look at it and say, okay, is it doable? And what is the impact of us actually doing this? And how are we actually going to do it? What does it mean if we were to do it? Clearly, £1 million is no longer going to cut it because the scope has changed. Clearly, it's no longer going to be 6 months. But that whole process where we impact assess a request for change and we look to execute changes in a controlled manner, that is what we call change control. Now, anybody who's run projects, even if it's as simple as a child's birthday party to as complicated as multi-site migrations for a data center, knows that things rarely ever go to plan. So the whole concept of change control is to ensure that when those changes come in, you are able to deal with them in a controlled manner, taking into consideration what is changing, why you need to change it, and the impact of this change. So taking into consideration that, okay, if we are now going to do a lot more, what does this mean for us for a cost perspective? Or it might even be that we're shrinking the scope, so we're doing less. What does this mean from a time perspective? Because time is money. What does this mean from a money perspective in terms of budget? So it's that entire holistic view, and there's processes that follow the whole change control process. So you can see the difference between change management and change control. And these are things that you would often find quite prevalent in most corporate environments, much more if you're dealing with any sort of project management. So I hope that makes sense for you. Let me hear your questions. Send me in your comments. Like our videos, subscribe, please. We'll be really appreciative if you would do that. And let's hear your thoughts on your ideas about change control and change management. As I always say, it's really not rocket science.